Welcome back. Now we're going for part two of our lecture on Sufi practices and well-being. So I wanted to bring in some of the positive psychology literature with regard to these Sufi practices that we've been talking about today, the orders, the gatherings, the chanting, and so forth. So one study found that an emotionally expressive worship style, which is characteristic of many of the Sufi orders, is associated with high levels of life satisfaction. Research has also shown that specific meditation practices of the sort in which the Sufis typically engage increase positive emotions. There's a difference in the positive psychology literature between emotion and long-term subjective well-being. So you may do something that causes you to have positive emotions for a while. And listening to music is widely attested to be in that category. There are other things that you can do that have a long-lasting effect if you do them continuously on your subjective feeling of well-being, not just making you happy for a while. And meditation practices not only increase positive emotions, but they also seem to increase life satisfaction. They even are correlated with better health. Attending religious services, not Sufi services in particular, but religious services in general, are widely found to be closely associated with well-being. And when scholars have looked into why this may be, they've found that self-transcending positive emotions such as awe, gratitude, love, peace, precisely the kinds of emotions cultivated in Sufism, are strongly associated with a sense of well-being. All the literature is careful to say that they can't prove causality. That is to say, we can't know for sure that cultivating these emotions in religious ceremonies causes well-being, but when they give people the skills to do these things, they have higher rates of well-being than people who don't do those things. And there could be other explanations for it, their social class or and so forth, but the psychologists do try to account for those kinds of differences as well. So at the moment, what we can say is people who engage in these kinds of ceremonies that are centered on these kinds of positive emotions are also people that we find have a sense of well-being. There's a finding in the literature that listening to the recitation of the Qur'an, which of course all Muslims do and not just Sufis, can result in reduced heart rate, healthier blood pressure, soothed muscle tension. And these findings are irrespective of the listener's religion. That is, there's not just Muslims listening to the Quran who have these responses. And in that regard, it's possible that because the recitation of the Quran is melodious, that people are responding to it as they do to music, which also is associated with some of these positive benefits. I'm going to try to play for you a little Quran recitation, and I've never tried to do this inside these programs, so let's see if it works.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم سبحان الذي أسرى بعبده ليلا من المسجد الحرام أسرى بعبده ليلا من المسجد الحرام إلى المسجد الأقصى
So that's just to give you a notion of what we're talking about. That was an Egyptian Qur'an recitation. I lived in Egypt for about 4 years, and I find it extremely pleasant to listen to. I think I like the Egyptian style of recitation the best. But that's certainly a big part of the lives of pious Muslims. Then Sufis in particular do, as I mentioned, pursue meditation techniques. Some of these are centered on the divine names, and it's called dhikr, which means recollection or remembrance. It's a word that's often used in the Quran. And they'll, as this picture shows, often use a rosary to count off the names. The great Sufi thinker Ibn Ata'Allah of Alexandria, who died in the early 14th century, defined dhikr or remembrance as purification from heedlessness and forgetfulness by the constant presence of the heart with God. So remembering, saying, chanting, repeating the divine names is a way of staying close to God in this view. And he advised using the tongue, the heart, the soul, the spirit, the intellect, and the innermost conscience, deploying them all in the contemplation of the names of God. And by the names of God, I mean attributes of God that are mentioned in the Quran for the most part, which were collected together by Sufis for meditation purposes. God is the merciful, He's the compassionate, He's the loving, and so forth. Another Sufi practice was going into seclusion for a period of time every year. In the ancient histories of the Prophet Muhammad, it's alleged that he pursued this practice himself. So it's a kind of retreat. And some orders put more emphasis on this practice than others. The Khalwatiya in Syria, for instance, its name means seclusion or retreat. And while in retreat, the Sufi attempts to gain concentration, to avoid the cares of everyday life, and to avoid being surrounded with people asking them to do things. There's a dispute in the Sufi traditions over whether dhikr, or the remembrance of the names of God, should be silent or spoken aloud. And in any case, it can be spontaneous. It's not a ritual prayer as commanded in the Quran, the Salah. It can be done spontaneously without performing ablutions or getting ready for prayer in the way that Muslims do. This is something that they can launch into. The Naqshbandi order in particular insisted that it be done silently. As I mentioned before, some orders used breathing techniques. They engaged in cross-legged sitting, similar to yoga. Some of them tried to imagine their Sufi master, visualize that person's face, to sort of get a feeling that one was being watched over by this wise person. Some would chant, "There is no God but God," which is a key idea in Islam, or they might just chant God's name. Or some recommended that one think about where the chanting was in the body, because especially if it's being done silently, you could think about it being in your breast or in your tummy, etc. And these are all ways of concentrating on these names of God. Well, let me turn now away from those specific ritual practices to Sufi wisdom stories. How Sufis implemented their ideas about the desirability of wisdom, not only through gatherings and preaching and orders and rituals of various sorts, but also through the telling of stories. And Sufi wisdom stories are an enormous genre in literature, which, in my view, are still relatively little studied. I think that scholars have not known sometimes what exactly to make of them. Let's take one that I assigned to the class for today, the story that Rumi tells of the three fish. So he says there were three fish in a lake, and of course this is kind of like a folk story, but it's being put to a particular purpose. There were three fish in the lake, and some fishermen arrived on the shore of the lake, which is of course a very bad sign if you're a fish. So the most intelligent of the three fish, or the wisest, I would say, of the three, immediately decided to leave and to swim through a tributary out towards the ocean. Now, this fish didn't consult with his two colleagues about this decision because he was afraid that they might try to dissuade him, or might succeed in dissuading him, because after all, leaving your home is a big step, and then they would feel lonely if he left, and so forth. So he just took off, and he swam all the way to the sea. The fish of middling wisdom, medium wisdom, knew there was a danger but wasn't ready to leave the lake. And so he decided to go belly up and play dead. So the fishermen saw him there and thought that's easy pickings, and they pulled him out of the lake and tossed him to the side. I don't know if they were very interested in the dead fish anyway, because after all, it could have died of some disease that would be bad to eat it. So they just tossed it aside, didn't pay attention to it, and that fish was able to flap his way back into the water and then escape from them. In Rumi's telling, the least wise of the fish tried to jump around and escape the net that the fisherman had put out, but failed. It wasn't quite agile enough to avoid being caught. And he was then obviously in a very difficult position, and he vowed that if he managed to get away from these fishermen, that he would do as the first fish had done and just make straight for the infinite ocean. So this folk story about the three fish is obviously being told by Rumi as an allegory. The lake are the cares and desires of this world, and full of danger, spiritual danger. And in order to escape that danger, the wise person has to detach herself from this home, from this home that seems comfy and pleasant, but actually is full of dangers. So one problem for Rumi in this story is that he's advising people to leave their home, which is to say the place that they psychologically feel comfortable in. And there is a saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad that love of one's home or birthplace is an element of faith. But Rumi simply says that the Prophet here isn't talking about the physical birthplace. He's talking about the true home, which in his allegory is actually the ocean. It's the true home towards which the wise fish swim. So the fishermen are the danger to the soul. The sea is the divine realm of God. It's infinity. It's that towards which the Sufi is striving. And within this folk story about the three fish, Rumi tells yet another fable. And so in literary terms, the story of the three fish is the frame story. Inside the frame story, there's another story. And that's a typical medieval Arabic and Persian narrative device, and it is resorted to because it was felt by authors that audiences are easily bored. And so you need a plot twist. You need something that will wake them up. And so the story of the three fishes is relatively predictable once it's announced that the first one escapes directly. You kind of know what's coming for the third one. So in the middle of this story, Rumi tells the fable of the bird. So a man catches a bird in a trap, but the bird, being clever, convinces the man to let it go. Obviously, it's a parrot or some kind of a bird that can speak. And in the fable, it convinces the man to release it from the trap, in return for which the bird promises the man 3 pieces of wisdom. So the first piece of wisdom that the bird bestows on the man is never believe in an absurdity, no matter who says it. So this is, in philosophical terms, an attack on the fallacy of authority. Some ways of thinking would have you believe that, say, a holy book says something, it must be true even if it seems absurd. This principle, it seems to me somewhat individualistic and rational, that it says never believe in an absurdity, no matter who says it. So then the second principle, the bird tells the man in return for its freedom, is do not grieve over what is past. And that is a very important sentiment in Sufism more generally. So then the bird, having given the first 2 pieces of wisdom, flies away to the roof where the man can't get at it again. And once it's at the roof, the bird plays a trick on the man, says, you poor fool, I had this enormous pearl inside of me. It's almost as big as me. And if you had kept me, you would have had that pearl. You missed your chance. So the man took the bird seriously, and he was upset. He wailed. He cried. He said, "Oh no! I could have had this wonderful pearl. I could have been a rich man." So then the bird says, "Guy, I just told you, don't believe in absurd things. And how likely is it that I have a pearl in me as big as me? Where would it be exactly?" and I'm a small bird, I can't contain a massive pearl. And then the second principle was, but you're not supposed to grieve over what is past. Well, that was an opportunity that anyway was past. So there you are crying. You made yourself miserable by violating these two precepts that I gave you. So the man said, well, okay, what's the third principle? And the bird says, you don't get the third principle. You didn't prove worthy of the first two because you had failed those tests. And so then he flew away. So this is a typical kind of wisdom story that you'll see as you read through the Essential Rumi is typical of Rumi's teaching style. But one of the things that's interesting to me about it is that it seems to me awfully individualistic in its emphases. And we talked before about how medieval Sufism was all about obedience to the Sufi master and it didn't really value independence of thought. But in these teaching stories, the seeker is being advised to adopt a kind of individualism. So the first fish escapes from the pond through his wisdom, refusing to consult with his colleagues who might drag him down with their conventionality. So a kind of originality, a kind of individual action is being urged. And then it's not necessarily in contradiction with the idea that you should follow your peers' teachings because the sea itself probably symbolizes the Sufi master's teachings. But it is an insistence that the Sufi path is not necessarily a conventional one and that one may have to strike out on one's own accord. So I'll bring this lecture to an end here and just conclude that we've seen that Sufism has an individual component. One has to make one's own individual spiritual decisions, Rumi is telling us. But it also had a very strong social component, and that component grew over time. So the first few generations of Sufis might have been pious individuals, kind of ascetic in their lifestyle, somewhat secluded from society. But then in later centuries, Sufism became an organized force. It became a set of societies drawn from particular social niches, involving regular meetings, hierarchies of knowledge, and rituals, group rituals, as well as occasional individual seclusion. That gave the Sufi orders a social position. Sometimes they deployed it for various purposes. They could support a king or oppose a king. And some of them actually became military forces. The practices that Sufis are engaged in are the sorts of practices that positive psychology researchers have found are highly correlated with, at least, a sense of well-being, positive emotions, and generally what we would call happiness. So Sufism, in my view, as a historian, became the major form of Islam in the medieval period from the 1200s until the 20th century. I think most Muslims throughout the world were more or less Sufis, with maybe the exception of Iran, where Shiite Islam took up some of these same functions. But even some of the modernist reformers that we think about in places like Egypt, if you look into their biography, they belong to a Sufi order. Sufism has declined enormously in the past century. Some of its social manifestations maybe weren't compatible with aspects of modernity. I once tried to track down the remaining members of the Mevlevi order, which is Rumi's order, in Lebanon, in the city of Tripoli in the north. And there was a mansion that had been a lodge for the order atop a hill. And I and a friend went up there, and we knocked on the door. We wanted to meet a little old lady came to the door, and we told her we wanted to meet the Sufi master. And she said, "Oh, that's my brother." She said, "He died some years ago, but why don't you come in?" So she gave us tea, and she told us, "Oh, yes, this was a very lively place. The young men would come in the evenings, and they would play the reed flute, and they would dance on one foot for hours." And I looked down from this mansion onto Tripoli, and there was all kind of hustle and bustle and building of multi-story buildings and factories. And I thought to myself, well, who has time to whirl on one foot for hours? So that order had gone into complete decline. I think it no longer functioned. So some of the leisure that was necessary to that kind of Sufism, and remember the Mevlevis were an upper class order, some of the leisure has declined. And I think consumer society, work time discipline of industrial society, all makes certain kinds of medieval Sufi formations more difficult to pursue. But then there is neo-Sufism, there's modern Sufism, which becomes part of modern urban society. But for various reasons, Sufi spirituality has declined a great deal in much of the Muslim world. It's still vigorous in some places, Indonesia, India and Pakistan, and Senegal. Sufis practically run that place. Morocco, it's still big. But in Egypt, it's become a minority taste, and Egypt is one of the major countries in the Middle East. And it's declined in favor in some places. Like Afghanistan had been a big center of Sufism, but the more fundamentalist kind of Islam of the Taliban now has become more powerful, at least in the Pushtun areas. But in those places where it's still practiced, I think it's probably practiced because